Savior, Jesus Christ. Well, Jennifer and I this summer have discovered an organization called the Fruit Club. They actually bring semi-loads of fruit direct from the orchards. And usually you can buy this straight off of the truck. They bring these trucks in the parking lot at various establishments throughout town, very specific times, like 2 to 3 hour windows, maybe 2 or 3 times a month. And so you have to know when they're going to be there. But we just stumbled on it, and we bought peaches there this summer that were otherworldly. I have stopped buying peaches from the stores because so many times they just aren't very good. And these were absolutely phenomenal. And apple season is going to be beginning shortly. And the reason that we really like this arrangement is the quality of the fruit. I mean, at least the peaches were so much better. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I believe the reason is that sometimes I think the stuff we get in the stores, they pick it too early. And it's not close to being ripe yet, and it ends up ripening in the storage unit or somewhere on the way, and I just think it doesn't taste as well. And this here, again, within 2 days of being picked, it's in your kitchen ready to eat. And I share this story this morning because I think it's a good image of our Old Testament reading today. Our Old Testament was from the book of Amos. Amos was a farmer, more specifically a sheep herder, and he was inspired by God to challenge the Israelite nation for the injustices of their political and religious leaders that were going on back then. If we were to go back and look at the early part of chapter 8, which was preceding our reading today, the prophet was shown a basket of ripe fruit. And this ripe fruit was to signify how Israel was ripe for judgment. God had been warning them over really a century or two about their lifestyle and what they were doing, and God was ignored, and they just continued to do this. And so now judgment was about to come upon them. Well, what was their offense? Well, that was actually pretty well spelled out in our Old Testament reading. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end. Basically, the leaders of Amos' time abused their power in order to benefit themselves, while the poor in the community were ignored. The greed of the powerful was so complete that they could not wait until the Sabbath was over so that they could resume their business and continue to rip off the people with what they were doing. If we could pick it up in verse 5, it says, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale? You know, as we go through this passage, you're going to see initially the merchants when they begin to speak, they were merely greedy, but now they're beginning to transition, and as we continue forward, their greed gives way to dishonesty. As we continue, it says, that we may make the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances. To make the ephah small and the shekel great meant that customers would receive less than they had paid for. That rich merchants would accumulate more and more unjust wealth. And as we read further, their dishonesty gives way to dehumanizing acts of injustice toward the poor. Verse 6, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. You know, trading in produce was not enough. They are willing to trade in the slavery of human lives. Wealthy people ruthlessly exploiting the system in which people who cannot afford to pay debts must sell themselves or sell their children into slavery. People have become no more than commodities to the moneyed classes of Israel. The words, "You shall love your neighbor as yourselves," have long ceased to be operative in this land. And then the verse continues, "And then to sell the chaff of the wheat." You know, chaff of the wheat probably was a combination of chaff, which is just the hulls around the wheat, and the dirt from the threshing floor, and perhaps a few grains of wheat. And so the merchants buy and sell with rigged scales, and they are not ashamed of actually selling a refuse of good wheat, thus maximizing their own profit at the expense of their customers. Finally, in closing of our reading then, the Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, "Surely I will never forget any of their deeds." You know, pride goes before a fall. And the pride of Israel is about to lead to a great fall. Part of Israel's greatness was that the people saw themselves as accountable to someone higher, someone over and above their own opinions. If we go back to chapter 7 of Amos, it talks about how God, the Lord of Israel, holds up a plumb line. Now, a plumb line is what measures the straightness or the trueness of a wall or a building. And so God held this plumb line up against Israel and found it was crooked. It was not true and straight and was in deep wanting. Surely I will not forget. As we look at this passage this morning and apply it to our lives, I think the first thing that we can look at is ourself. Are we fair? Do we treat other people fairly, regardless of their economic or their social status? Pastor Steve May, a pastor, shares a story from his business experience. He writes, "Years ago, I was involved in a business meeting in which one of our clients tried to persuade my boss to cut some corners that were, at the very least, unethical. My boss confronted the man and said something along the lines of, 'Are you suggesting what it sounds like you're suggesting?' The man hemmed and hawed and finally said, 'Yes.' My boss stood up and said, 'This meeting is over, and so is our relationship.' Then he stormed out of the office. And it was his office. The client sat there dumbfounded, and frankly, so did I. My boss came back 15 seconds later and said, 'Did you hear me? The meeting is over. Steve will show you to the door.' And he sat down at his desk and started going through his mail. I knew my boss desperately needed the business this client offered, but he didn't want the client's money bad enough to cheat others. Would you and would I have the guts to do what is right in the Lord's eyes in those situations? To not take advantage of others? You know, we speak of worship. Worship is something that we do here on Sunday morning, but worship continues on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, continues through our whole life as we witness and as we do what is right. That is what our worship is about, and that is one of our challenges this morning as we read this verse. So as we apply it, I think first we need to look at ourselves and examine how we deal with others. But I think a second thing we can do with this passage this morning is to explore, is actually to look outward, to look at our culture today and how it actually looks very similar to this culture that Amos lived in, and then possibly to explore how to cope in this culture that can be as corrupt